Hi guys, so today's video is going to be both a non-spoiler book review and a little bit of a spoilery chat for Baptism of Fire by Andrzej Sapkowski. For those of you that are brand new to the Witcher series and you've not read any of the books that lead up to this one, don't worry, in the non-spoiler portion of the video, I'm not going to be spoiling anything, not just for this book, but for any of the books leading up to this one. And also, even though it's marked book 3 on the spine, I do consider this to be more like book 5 because I highly recommend reading The Last Wish and Sword of Destiny before starting the official series, as those collections of short stories provide a lot of context. This was a reread for me. I just previously hadn't reviewed the individual books in this series, but I found whenever I would talk about this particular one, I always said that Baptism of Fire was my absolute favorite out of all of them, including the collections of short stories. And upon rereading it, I don't know that I necessarily feel the same anymore. In a lot of ways, the story is about people being intertwined by destiny and how much of a choice do you have in that, and as well as the relationships between Geralt, the main character, the Witcher, and some of the other characters in the story. And in this particular book, I would say we have Geralt at the forefront. I love Geralt. He's one of my favorite characters, not just in this series, but in fiction in general. And the first time I read this, absolutely loved that we spent so much time with him. In the collections of short stories, you'll find that they're basically all about Geralt, and then of course the bigger themes and fairy tale retellings. And then once the official series starts, I would say that's when Witcher really starts to come into its own. It's not quite as inspired, at least from what I have knowledge of, because my knowledge of Central and Eastern European folklore is much more limited than some other fans. But from what I can tell, the inspirations aren't as strong in the official series. It's when it becomes its own story, its own folklore. And I found that I really loved in the first two, The Last Wish and Sword of Destiny, how centered they were around Geralt. But then once the official series starts, there are times in the first two of the official series where I felt there was such an absence of Geralt because I had come to love him so much in those first two. That's confusing. I'm just going to say the short stories. In the short stories, I'd come to love him so much. And then I found in my first read that I was slightly disappointed in the lack of Geralt with Blood of Elves and Time of Contempt. So I found for myself personally, we got around to Baptism of Fire. It really felt like we were focusing in on Geralt again. And on top of that, this book, I would say, for the Witcher series, it really highlights some of the camaraderie, and it also really shows the brutality of war. I think perhaps better than some of the other books in the series, perhaps even the best, I would say, in the entire series. And it does so in a way that it manages to have our characters who are part of what feels like a merry band of misfits, where there are humorous moments and there are lighthearted moments and there's a lot of them kind of getting on each other's nerves. It's just, you've got that with this juxtaposition of them traveling and seeing absolutely horrific things, and how they have to then find more significance in their friendships because the world is just so dark and the results of war are horrendous. And so I found that juxtaposition to be really well done. I absolutely loved I feel bad saying I love Sapkowski's portrayal of war, but I just find that sometimes in books you hear that there is war and it either is so extremely brutal that it almost feels like shock value, or it's very glossed over and it's somewhat romanticized. And there's a place in fiction for all sorts of different kinds of tastes and portrayals of war. But in this one, I just found I haven't seen too many fantasy books that do such a fantastic job of taking characters that aren't really involved in the war and having them see the consequences of war. In a lot of fantasy stories, rather than following people who are observing the consequences of war, you are following the people that are directly involved with the war, whether they be generals or warriors, knights, kings, queens, just people somehow in the midst of it all. And that kind of a story inherently has action woven into it, whereas in this book, there really isn't a lot of action. I think sometimes the idea of there being this awesome monster hunter with a setting that has so much war leads you to think that there's going to be a lot of fighting and that there's going to be really cool fight scenes in general. And you get hints of it here and there, but overall I'd say that's really not the highlight of this story. If you're the kind of person that likes that in fantasy, that's not really what you're going to get with this one. Also, I do find that this particular one, it is very much a traveling story, and so you are going to find that it meanders. That is something that just comes with traveling stories, and sometimes the meandering can lead to some very real and relatable situations, and then other times you find that if you don't really care about what's happening, you kind of almost can't help thinking like, well, what's the point of this? Even though there's really I don't want to say there's no point to anything in this story, but with traveling stories, they have that feeling of randomness to them. And when I find I like the randomness, then I'm enjoying what's going on. And if I don't like the randomness in certain points, then I'm just like, oh, okay, when's this over? As far as traveling stories go, for the most part, I was always very thoroughly entertained because the characters, like I was saying with the camaraderie and the friendship and just the merry band of misfits, the way they all come together with such differing personalities and the morally gray characteristics in all of the party members, it makes for, they feel so real. They feel like such real characters. They don't feel like, to me, caricatures. They don't feel like, oh, this one's comic relief, this is the gruff guy, this is the cool archer girl. That's what they are on surface, but they feel very much like real people. As a result, whenever they would have arguments or start to get on each other's nerves, I feel like I got frustrated sometimes too, and I could just imagine certain characters in that situation. I could imagine being that character and being fed up with the character Dandelion because he's so dumb sometimes, or Geralt because he's just got this ridiculous sense of like, I have to do everything by myself and I don't have feelings. Grr. And you just sometimes are like, oh my gosh, guys, please stop. In the same way that you do when you have a roommate or a sibling or just somebody that you're forced to be in close proximity to for a long period of time, and then when you're having to deal with seeing really terrible things, and on top of that, you're hungry, you have to hunt for food, you're afraid you're going to run into the army, and it's just, there's so much going on, and so it just feels like the tension between the characters sometimes is at an all-time max, but then when there's these funny moments, it just makes them that much more hilarious, but also important, and it just grounds you in the simple things that make us people. That sounds so dramatic, but that's kind of one of the things I think Sapkowski just does phenomenally. I've basically been praising this book the whole time, even though I start off by saying that upon reread, I didn't find I enjoyed it quite as much. And so I'm going to get into why I think that is. So I, like a lot of people in the US and a lot of other places in the world, came into Witcher through the video game, The Wild Hunt. I am so in love with that game, and I played all of it, and then I was like, I want to read the books that inspired this game. And so when I got to this book, I found this book was the most similar to the game itself. I did kind of crave the tone and the feeling of the video game when I was picking up this series. I was enjoying it, but then when I got to this one, it just felt like coming home. Because it was my second time though, there are certain things that Sapkowski does that I think he's masterful at. There are other times that there are certain things Sapkowski does that I don't like, and one of those things would be sometimes I find he lingers on the mundane for a little longer than I personally would like. I think the biggest example of this is when we have a bunch of prominent sorceresses in their world that come together to discuss something. And during this discussion, they start talking about the family history, basically, of some individuals. Well, this person is the father of this person, and this is the mother of this person, and because of these genes, this is how sometimes you can produce this certain thing in these people. And there's also this lore about this one person in the history, and you're probably already sick of me talking about it, and I was, after a while, I'm like, I don't care. And some people eat that stuff up because they love the lore part of things, they love the family tree, but I have just personally found I've never been a fan of that, and all it does for me is make the story drag a little. My last personal thing about the story that brought it down a little bit in enjoyment was that the book that is just before this one, we spend a significant amount of time with one of our characters, Siri. And to the point where after a while, kind of again, my whole like, I get it, can we move past this now? That was definitely prevalent in the last chunk of Time of Contempt. And in this story, we basically don't see that character at all. We get very, very brief glimpses of them, and for me, I just feel like we spent so much time with a certain event at the end of Time of Contempt, and then we get to this one and we basically don't see that character at all. And it's so funny because I said earlier, the first time I was reading this, I was so happy that we spent so much time with Geralt, and I think reading it again, I wanted to get to see our character more, especially with the path they're currently on. I feel like we could have done more with seeing how awful this certain thing was for them and how grueling it was for them, and how they're kind of getting involved with things that are not the best. I'm trying not to give away spoilers, but this character is getting involved with certain things, I think, as a means of companionship, as well as hiding from all of the difficult things they had to go through. I mean, Ciri is an absolutely fascinating character, and as somebody that perseveres more than almost any other character that I can think of, the amount of times this poor girl has to basically, pick herself up and keep on going and just do it all herself, the amount of times that happens to her is awful, and you just can't help but feel so bad for her. But a lot of it happens off page. I feel like this was a fantastic opportunity to show us how she is getting through this, and you get to really see her determination, her perseverance, and instead, like I said, we're spending time with family trees. That is it for the non-spoiler portion of this video. If you don't want to be spoiled for anything, stop watching now. Getting into spoilers. So I have a very specific thing that I want to mention that I'm curious your thoughts on. So there's this idea of unreliable narrators, where the person that the story is being told through, the information they're providing the reader, you can't necessarily trust that information. And there is something in this book that's not quite that, but it falls into the same sort of thinking. And that is during the scene that I mentioned not loving, where they talk about Ciri's family, her descendants, and they're going through this. And Sapkowski goes initially from Triss Marigold's thoughts and then later to Yennefer's thoughts. And when he's with Triss is listening to this woman talk about their involvement, or not their involvement. Triss decides she's discerning based off of what this woman, this other sorceress, is saying, that Yennefer probably had some involvement with the pairings in Ciri's bloodline. And Triss is thinking like, oh, if only Geralt knew that you did this, if only he knew, you must have used certain things to make people fall in love, or use other things to make people not be able to have children. She's having all these thoughts about all these things that she believes Yennefer did just by looking at Yennefer sitting there quietly. And then you go to Yennefer, and Yennefer's like, oh my gosh, I have to rescue Ciri. I gotta get out of here. Just like, be chill, play it chill, and then you can try to run away as soon as the opportunity arises. And so I found that was this whole thing with Triss thinking Yennefer for sure was involved in the pairings of certain individuals in Ciri's history, her bloodline. Was that a fact, or is that something that Triss believes and you as the reader might believe? Because we don't really get confirmation of that. And at the moment, I'm not recalling if there's other instances where we do get confirmation of it. I know Yennefer was somewhat involved and definitely had her eyes on Ciri, but I don't remember for sure if that ever gets cleared up. So I'm kind of asking you guys, but I just find that if it is true, and I gotta be fair here, I've always disliked Triss for her whole I just really wanted to bang Geralt, so I used some harmless magic to get him to sleep with me, and then I reveled in his guilt. That whole thing, I'm like, you're super messed up. That is so weird, and also not cool. But if Yennefer really did kind of push people toward each other with the use of magic, I mean, that's super messed up too. So like I said, I gotta be equal here. But maybe it's just wishful thinking. Yennefer doesn't really confirm it, and Triss is just assuming based off of seeing Yennefer sitting there quietly looking very tense. But I, as the reader, was like, she's tense because she wants to go find Ciri. She does not want to be involved with this lodge, and she knows the lodge has plans for Ciri, and she's like, no, I'm going to go rescue my girl. So, I don't know. Curious your thoughts. In this particular book, I found that it has some of my absolute favorite scenes. Zoltan is... I love that character, and I just feel like he has the biggest heart, and he's way more self-aware than a lot of the other characters throughout the Witcher series. The ending portion when him and Geralt part ways, and Geralt, he keeps seeing Zoltan taking in all of these refugees and trying to help them, and then he thinks highly of him, but Zoltan tells him, like, hey man, I gotta come clean and confess that I stole from a rich guy, and that's what all that stuff is over there that we've been hauling this whole time that we're going to try to make a life off of. So I'm not really that good of a guy. I'm not saying stealing somebody's stuff is cool and all, but on the scale of bad acts in the Witcher world, stealing some goods from somebody, I mean, that's pretty low. There's some pretty terrible things that happen in Witcher, and I just feel like Zoltan's like, I stole some stuff, like, I'm a pretty bad person too. Are you even gonna shake my hand? I'm just like, oh, Zoltan, you're so cute. Dandelion, as usual though, and they say Dandelion in the audiobook, which I think is really interesting, but I'm gonna call him Dandelion. He is so dumb in this book. I mean, he's always an idiot, but he's especially stupid in this book to the point where I'm like, dude, come on. When they're traveling through this war-torn land and they're seeing awful things, and then they hear some people singing and marching, and instead of being like, shoot, we better be quiet and go see what's up, because those could be the Nilfgaardians or they could be soldiers. I mean, they think to themselves, that doesn't really sound like the song that soldiers would sing. It doesn't really seem like that's what that is. But, I mean, Geralt and Dandelion already had some issues with people who were just trying to be traitors. Early traitors as in with a D, not like traitors. Traders, people trading stuff. They already had some issues way earlier in the story with people that aren't even soldiers. So Dandelion hears Zoltan and his gang marching along, singing a song, and he just like pulls out his thing and starts playing and singing and being like, hey, I'm over here. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, you're just so stupid. The audacity, because it's not like he's the one that can get them out of a situation if things get a little dirty. He's the one that gets shot in the head, like grazed with an arrow, and then flips out, and he's whining, and he's like, I'm dead, they've killed me, and just, he's so dumb. It was almost hard to take. I mentioned him getting graced with the arrow, which I have to mention how much I love that part in general, because he's such... I mean, I'd probably be freaking out too. Maybe not, though. I feel like I'm tougher than him, to be honest. But in that part, I love the line where he is like, they've killed me. And then Sapkowski says something along the lines of, like, he declared especially loud for somebody who was dead or something. It's just... I don't know, I really like, this is the kind of thing in a lot of my book reviews I talk about. If you're going to do omniscient, or if you're going to do a form of omniscience, I like when the narration has almost like its own voice, and every now and then the narration can kind of be like, hee, isn't that kind of funny, like it's mocking the scene, and he does this really well, I think, and that's a perfect example. Milva is a character that I think is so underrated. She's one of my favorite characters. And I think she's an example of the tough, awesome chick that has kind of become a trope at this point. But she was like the OG. Because these books are not brand new. And Milva was over there shooting better than anybody. And she's just so feisty. And what I really like too is she's not amazing at everything. She has no problem admitting every now and then, she's like, I'm not particularly educated. Can you stop talking fancy for a second? Or she gets all frustrated with them when, especially Regis, when he's being all uppity, and when sometimes Geralt's being a little uppity. And she's so blunt and forward, but also really compassionate. I mean, outwardly, she's constantly very confrontational, but she's given up so much just to go help Geralt find Ciri. So I feel like deep down, she's a little softy. I also personally really appreciated how Sapkowski wrote and went about Milva's pregnancy. I think that he always does such a good job of taking real world, modern day issues that we still have really heated conversations about. He takes those same topics and he weaves them into his stories in ways that feel incredibly organic, despite the fact that it's a fantasy world and it's supposed to basically be set in a different time. He does it in a way where it feels very natural, it makes sense to the story, and he doesn't tell you which side you're supposed to pick. And whether I agree or disagree with authors, what the situation they're showing you, I find that it's pretty easy usually to tell which side the author thinks is the right side. And I find that the inability to show both sides of the situation for me is either an insecurity in your own belief because you're not even willing to depict a reasonable character with an opposing viewpoint. So it's either an insecurity in what you think, or it's just a lack of maturity because you're not even willing to show that there are opposing sides. You don't even want to, it's like, I don't even want to humor that. And I really appreciate that Sapkowski, he really just showed the situation, but I personally never once felt like Sapkowski was trying to shove down our throat a certain belief. I don't think he was like pushing an agenda. He just presented a situation. It was a difficult one. The characters had their thoughts on that situation, and then things happened as a result. But I personally never got the impression I was being told what I was supposed to think was the right answer. And then lastly, of course, we have Regis. And I really loved that on the surface, Regis is just the most likable character. He's calm and he's collected and he's intelligent. He's a good addition to the ensemble, and he is somebody that I just think he obviously is extremely powerful and has all these cool things that he can do, but also he's just so pleasant. He's so pleasant. But I mentioned in the non-spoiler portion that I really liked how the characters, despite that they all like each other, the close proximity thing can just make you get super frustrated with the most basic of things. So toward the end, when Geralt is just getting so fed up with Regis and he's like, oh, can you just stop patronizing me? Or, oh, he's got that fancy way of talking where he can't just let us know what's going on. I just think that I loved that. I loved that element of the story. Anyway, that is it for my non-spoiler and spoilery review for Baptism of Fire. I hope you guys enjoyed what eventually turned into rambling. But anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys later. Bye.